Chairman, thank you. I was listening to the previous comments. Can I just make one major point, which is that the union between Scotland and England is a voluntary union, and it resulted from Scotland effectively making a disastrous financial foray into South America and essentially becoming a bankrupt country. But there are, I think, a couple of points to bring us right up to date. And I've heard the speech this morning, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out. The SNP, yes, it controls the Scottish Parliament. David Cameron, our previous Prime Minister, gave away effectively a lot more power to the Scottish Parliament to try and pacify them after the referendum outcome. And therefore, they do have a significant amount of clout. But they have been told repeatedly by the Commission, by Mr Tusk, by Mr Juncker, that no special deal can be done. And I think we ought to actually accept that that is the case, rather than trying to circumvent the European mechanism that's already sending a very, very clear signal. I think the other point I would like to make, but I welcome the comment from our speaker this morning. How do you reconcile the aspect that in terms of the population who are prepared to vote both in independence referendums and in also, as in independence for Scotland, but also independence from the European Union, on one hand they're able to send a very clear message that they support the SNP in terms of independence there, and yet when you come right up to date, at the moment, a significant proportion are saying no, they don't want that anymore. They don't want another referendum. And this is where Mrs Sturgeon has a real problem, in that she would like to have a second referendum, but she knows she hasn't got the political will to do that. So maybe a comment on how do you reconcile a political message that the SNP would like to send, and yet in complete contrast and contradiction, voters in Scotland are sending a very different message.
Thank you. Are there other questions? So I would give back the floor to Ms.
On clarity, when Mrs James referred to a second referendum, I think she meant a second Scottish independence referendum. Yes, yeah.
I give the floor to Mrs.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those interesting and challenging as well comments and questions. So let me try and deal with them. I think, Madam Chairman, you asked about the independence possibility of a Scottish independence referendum and the results. So I think I'll take the first and last questions together. It's been interesting that apart from the first 1 or 2 weeks after the referendum result, there's been no so-called Brexit bounce in the polls in terms of Scottish independence, which mostly stayed around the result in 2014, 45 to 55%. And that is, again, there seems to be a lot of things that have shifted in the last week in the UK, and the most recent Scottish independence poll suggested 49% in favour of independence and 51% against independence. That's obviously a very close point at which to start a referendum campaign. If there is a referendum campaign, it's very much higher than the point at which the pro-independence side started in the run-up to 2014. I think it's very hard, obviously, to predict a result. Diana James talked about sort of almost, how do you reconcile different views, and there was quite an interesting detailed YouGov poll back in the autumn that showed if you gave people multiple choice rather than just a binary choice, I think this is not exact figures, but around 36% wanted independence in the EU. A slightly small number than that wanted to be in the EU and the UK, even though that's no longer the option on the table. And then the last third had a mixture of wanting independence outside